Okay, am I sharing the screen, Nina?
I am going to make you a host, Vita.
Okay, because
So
I
we
didn't
share
think.
now. Mhm.
Okay, okay. Let's see what happens. Hmm, I'll just talk.
There we go.
Yeah. Just get rid of that. Okay, I'd like to welcome everyone and thank you for joining us here in cyberspace. This is the first time that I've ever done a Zoom presentation, so bear with me. I'd also like to thank my family and friends from wherever they are, Washington, D.C., St. Petersburg, Florida, Omaha, Nebraska, my daughters and my sister, my daughter's in Michigan, and I think my nephew here in Atlanta is on the line as well. But to everyone, welcome and thank you for coming. Today, my presentation, I'm going to document the life journey of one of the enslaved African-American families who worked and lived on the Smith Plantation in Roswell when the town was first established. One huge problem that faces anyone who studies enslaved African Americans is this: where does the story begin? Because the vast majority of enslaved African Americans never learned to read or write, we cannot hope to find a Bible somewhere where the dates of births, baptisms, marriages, and deaths were kept. But we have to start somewhere. So we begin with the better documented person who had close contact with the enslaved family and who did keep records concerning the families. For me today, this person was a plantation owner by the name of Archibald Smith. The life story of Archibald Smith is well documented. His story began on a plantation owned by his father in Savannah, Georgia. He was born in 1801. He was very well educated for a child of his time. He was even sent to boarding school in New Jersey for several years. He came back to the Savannah area, and at the age of 21, he inherited from his father 2 plantations and several families, enslaved families, who had lived and worked on those plantations. One of his plantations he called Jersey Point, and the other one he named St. Mary's. With his inherited enslaved workforce, he managed rice plantations near the St. Mary's River. But his rice planting business was not as successful as he needed it to be. So when one of his acquaintances by the name of Roswell King asked Smith to join him on a new venture in Cobb County, Georgia, Smith decided to leave his Savannah plantations, relocate to Cobb County, and invest in a textile mill that Roswell King intended to build. Along with Smith came John Dunwoody, James Bullock, Roswell King's son, Barrington King, and 1 or 2 other families, and they became the founders of the city of Roswell. In December of 1838, Archibald Smith arrived in Cobb County with his wife Anne, 2 children, and 21 enslaved men, women, and children. This was an unusual journey for the 21 enslaved people because they were mostly confined to the plantations they worked on most of their lives. Enslaved people were not allowed to leave their home plantations without permission, which was usually in the form of a written pass, or they left when they were sold to a new slave owner. This trip would have been very special for the children because if they had been born on the St. Mary's plantation, they most likely had never been anywhere beyond the plantation grounds. 47-year-old Nanny and her 4 children were in the Smith's caravan. Nanny had 2 sons, 22-year-old Alec and 16-year-old Frederick, and she had 2 daughters, 20-year-old Sue and 4-year-old Clarinda. I can imagine that Clarinda at 4 years old had a stream of questions that she asked her mother, like, how long are we going to be on this trip? And what are we going to see along the way? And how are we going to cook and eat? And where are we going to sleep while we're traveling? And where are we going to sleep once we get there? So to keep little Clarinda quiet, her mother might have given her a doll that looked something like this. Now, in addition to investing in the textile mill, Archibald intended to keep farming. But starting a new plantation was a lot of work, and that's why he brought so many enslaved people with him. The land that Smith had purchased in Cobb County was originally owned by Cherokee Indians. So there might have been a dwelling already on the land that Smith purchased that looked like this. Didn't work. There we go. Now that looks like a pretty sturdy home, but I can't imagine 21 people sleeping there, but that's probably where they had to sleep. So one of the things that was very necessary almost immediately after they came to Cobb County was to provide housing. But housing was not Smith's first priority. As soon as the weather warmed up, it would be time to plant the cash and food crops. So land clearing, plowing, and planting was a priority over building housing. In June, 5 months after the group had arrived, crops had already been planted and a crew had dug a 42-foot well. We know the exact depth of the well and the first crops that were planted because Smith kept notes in a record book of the work that was being done and the planting that was being done on the new plantation. Now there's an odd thing about the notes that Smith kept in his record book. When he wrote down what work was being done, he almost never wrote down the name of the person who actually did the work. For example, in September of 1842, Smith wrote this, quote, during month, made corn crib, sewed logs for other buildings, split clapboards, unquote. In April of 1844, he wrote this, quote, buckwheat planted near slave cabin, unquote. From the way that Smith wrote about the work being done, one might conclude that Smith did the work himself, but it is not logical to conclude that. Smith had too many enslaved men living on the plantation to do the work himself. Undoubtedly, the enslaved men were the ones who cleared and plowed the land and built their own cabins, and the enslaved women helped the men plant the crops. But there were rare occasions when Smith did refer to his enslaved workers. He called them hands, which meant the hands of the enslaved workers. That was the wrong button. Now, there was a system for determining how much work the enslaved people could do. An experienced adult worker was called a full hand. An inexperienced enslaved young adult worker was called a half hand. And an inexperienced child worker was a half or quarter hand, depending on their age. And Smith's hands were very busy. 6 months after they had arrived, the first buildings were built on the land. Smith wrote this in his record book for July 1st of 1839, quote, "Had a small house built, 2 rooms, and a shed with 2 rooms and a piazza, a stove house, and stable, 6 stalls," unquote. 4 days later, on July 5th, Smith wrote this, quote, "Rutabaga and sugar beets, also turnip patch by Negro house," unquote. This entry in Smith's record book shows that within 6 months of the group's arrival, there was at least 1 Negro house on the land for the enslaved people. But it doesn't appear to be the new house that was just built. On October 10th of 1839, Smith described more construction work in his record book. He wrote, quote, "Raised 2 log houses for the Negroes," unquote. Only 1 photograph of a cabin on the Smith property has survived. So this is most likely what the 2 log Negro houses looked like. You won't be able to see it very clearly. This photograph was probably taken sometime in the 1930s or 1940s before these buildings were demolished. But this particular photograph is available in the Smith family papers that are housed in the Georgia State Archives in Morrow, Georgia. Another important task that had to be done was to build fences to make sure that hogs and other farm animals did not get lost or find their way into the fields and damage the plants. In his record book on February 1st, 1840, Smith wrote this, quote, "Fence made around lots 390 and 391, unquote." Here again, Smith makes no mention of who the fence builder was. However, 10 days later, surprisingly, Smith does give the name of the fence builder. It was Morris, Clarinda's father. And 10 days later, Smith wrote again in his journal, quote, "Morris commenced making yard fence," unquote. And on February 27th, he wrote, quote, "Morris finished yard fence," unquote. To be given this task and to be recognized by name in Smith's record book, Morris must have been a trusted and skilled worker. But it seems that every member of Clarinda's family was assigned a very important job to do. Clarinda's oldest brother, Alec, had the special responsibilities of driver. And that does not mean that he drove the carriage. That means that he had to make sure that all the field hands woke up early in the morning and reported to the fields for work each day. And he had to make sure that every field hand worked all day until he told them it was time to stop. Clarinda's younger brother, Frederick, had the special privilege of leaving the plantation to go to work every day because he was hired out to work with a tanner in Roswell. Frederick must have also learned from his father how to do construction work. We know this because he was killed while constructing a building. In December of 1849, Smith described what happened in his record book. Quote, "My Negro named Frederick was killed by the fall of a beam as he worked on raising a building. He had been hired to work as a tanner," unquote. It's unusual for him to put this much information about any one enslaved person, but this was a big event because it was a financial loss to Smith. Frederick was 27 years old and he was considered a prime field hand, valued at $2,000, which in today's currency would be more like $10,000. And also because the wages that Frederick earned while he was working with the tanner were paid to Archibald Smith. But for Frederick's mother, Nanny, this would have been an extreme emotional loss, one that her entire family would have grieved, including her youngest daughter, Corinda. Now, while all this initial construction work was going on, Corinda was too young to help. From the ages of 4 to 7, Corinda had to keep herself busy all day while her parents and siblings worked. However, when Corinda turned 8 years old in 1842, her idle days were over. She would have to begin her daily work as a slave. In 1842, Smith's oldest daughter, Lizzie, was 14 years old, but her little sister, Helen, was a 1-year-old toddler. At 12, Lizzie was old enough to command her own personal maid. And since Lizzie and Clarinda were just 4 years apart in age, Clarinda was most likely chosen to take the job of serving as Lizzie's personal maid. Clarinda's mother might have suggested this to Mrs. Smith because Clarinda's mother, Nanny, and Clarinda's sister, Sue, were already serving as household servants. 2 years later, in 1844, when Clarinda was 10, the Smith family moved into a brand new house. We don't know the exact location of the first house that they lived in when they came to Cobb County. It was probably that 2-room house that was built in 1839. But when they moved into the new house in 1844, we also know that they had a new baby. The youngest child of the Smiths, the son, Archibald Jr., was born in 1844. The new house was closer to the center of Roswell, and it was farther away from the Negro houses where most of the enslaved workers lived. So this meant that the enslaved household servants would have to move closer to the house. They would have to find places to sleep in the attic of the new house or on the floors of rooms unused at night in the new house, or in outbuildings in the backyard. There were never a lot of houses for the enslaved on the property where the 1844 house was built. Let me show you what the 1844 house looked like, because it didn't look like what you would see when you go there today. I hope you can see that. This is the original house that was built in 1844. You can see that it was a very conventional farmhouse, nothing very elaborate, but it was very large. Now, as Lizzie's personal maid, Clarinda would have a lot to learn. She would have to get up early, get dressed, and eat so she could have things ready for Lizzie when she woke up. On winter mornings, Clarinda would have to bring hot embers from the kitchen to make a fire in the fireplace in Lizzie's bedroom. Then Clarinda would need to bring soap, towels, and a container of hot water upstairs to pour into the wash basin so that Lizzie could complete her morning cleansing ritual. Clarinda might also help Lizzie get dressed, and she might even help her comb her hair. When Lizzie went downstairs for breakfast, Clarinda would stay upstairs to make the bed, sweep the floors, and tend the fire. In the spring and summer, Clarinda might have to open windows and hang quilts and bed covers out of the windows to air out. She might have to take them downstairs to the washerwoman to wash those items in the cauldron in the backyard. And one thing Clarinda could not forget to do would be to dispose of the wash water and to empty the contents of all the bedroom chamber pots outside in the outhouse. And I have a picture of some of those items that Clarinda would have had to work with. These items are still in the house, and these are some of the items that Clarinda would have had to work with. And a lot of items from this particular generation are still in the house today. After the Smiths ate their breakfast, Mrs. Smith would give the cook and the other enslaved household servants their orders for the day. While Clarinda was still young, she might help some of the other enslaved household servants clear the breakfast table and wash the dishes. She would have to make sure that the chamber pots and the wash basin were rinsed out and returned upstairs to the bedroom so that they would be ready for use during the night and the next morning. After washing dishes, she would have to return the dishes to the shelves where they were stored. Then she might have to help the other household servants clean, dust, and sweep the other rooms in the house, the parlor, and the front porch. Candle holders that had been used the night before would have to be cleaned of melted wax. And oil lamps that were used the night before would have to be refilled with oil for the coming evening. For the rest of the day, until quitting time, Clarinda would have to remain in the house, ready to answer Lizzie's call. Sometimes Clarinda might have to run errands for her mother, her sister, or the cook, or another household servant. Though most of Clarinda's time was spent in the house and running errands, as she got older, Clarinda might have to go to the fields to help the other hands pick cotton during the harvest. In October of 1848, when Clarinda was 14, Smith wrote down that Clarinda picked 58 pounds of cotton in 2 days. This was a lot less than the 100 pounds a full hand was supposed to pick in 1 day. So she was not yet a full hand. In 1861, when the US Civil War started, Clarinda was 27 years old, and she had by then an 11-year-old daughter named Maria. She had worked in the household of the Smiths by this time for almost 20 years, and her sister and mother had worked in the household even longer. But the Smiths made the decision to vacate their home in Roswell to escape the advancing Union Army. And when they did that, Mrs. Smith counted on Clarinda to help her pack household necessities to take to Valdosta, which is where they would stay during the rest of the war. Mrs. Smith's reliance on Clarinda reveals that Clarinda most likely knew the Smith household as well as Mrs. Smith did. In a letter that Mrs. Smith wrote to her son in 1864, she said this, quote, "Father writes that he hopes I am getting things packed, but I have not done anything yet. Corinda has not been able to leave her house for several weeks, and I have not felt strong enough to undertake the work, particularly as I do not know what to put up when everything is in use," unquote. By 1861, when the war started, not many members of Clarinda's family were left. Her elderly mother and father were probably deceased. Her brother Frederick had been killed in an accident, and her brother Alec had been sold. What might have happened to Clarinda's sister Sue is still not clear. Sue would have been 43 years old in 1861, and by then she was the mother of 8 or 9 children. We do know, though, that Clarinda, her daughter, and Sue's children, and maybe Sue, we don't know for sure, and most of the other enslaved families all had to move to Valdosta when the Smiths moved. But when the war was over, when the Smiths returned to Roswell, Clarinda, her daughter Maria, and Sue's children stayed in Valdosta. At last, Clarinda and the other enslaved people were free to decide where they wanted to live. All enslaved people everywhere in the US were granted their freedom when the Union forces finally won the Civil War in 1865. Since Clarinda had spent most of her life as an enslaved servant in close contact with the Smiths, perhaps Clarinda wondered how they were coping without her after the war. Whatever her reasons were, Clarinda contacted the Smith family from her home in Valdosta. In 1886, 20 years after the Civil War ended, Clarinda dictated a letter to her granddaughter, Hetty. The letter was addressed to Miss Lizzie. And 6 years later, in 1892, Clarinda dictated another letter to Master Archie. These 2 letters that Clarinda sent have survived, and they have been preserved in documents of the Smith family. So we can look at these letters and read them. Clarinda's voice in her letters suggests an intimacy that is difficult to maintain after 20 years absence, without having had frequent close contact at an earlier time. So let's take a look at Clarinda's letter, and we can read it ourselves and decide what kind of relationship Clarinda might have had and what her letter means. Now, if you're not used to looking at 19th century handwriting, I understand that it's very difficult to read. So I will read it for you. You can follow along. It comes from Valdosta, Georgia, March the 16th, 1886. Miss Lizzie, I take this opportunity of writing you a few lines to let you know that we all are well at this time. Hoping this few lines may find all well. That we heard that old master was dead, and I write to find out whether it was so or not. I would like to know how all the family is getting along. Master Archie, I did not know you was in Valdosta until you was gone. I would like to have seen you very much. Tell Miss Lizzie, Maria has 5 children. Moses' family all send much love to you, and they all are well, and Sylvie has 11 children. Dinah was married and was in Savannah, Georgia, and she has 3 children. Dinah died last October. Please write as soon as you get this, and please to send me my age. You sent me my age once, but it got misplaced. Please to send me Maria's age. They all must, Miss Helen, Miss Lizzie, Master Archie, they all must send me something. Tell me when you write, please. Tell me when you write. Please direct in the care of Mr. Middleton. This is Marie's oldest child writing, Hetty. I will close by saying, remember me. Please write to me as often as you can. Clarinda Richardson. It's clear from this letter that Clarinda had exchanged greetings or messages about the Smith family by word of mouth, most likely through people who traveled to and from Valdosta and Roswell. Corinda doesn't mention her sister Sue in this letter. Sue would have been 68 in 1886, so it's quite likely that Sue was deceased. But what conclusions would you draw from Clarinda's letter? You might be able to type some things or just jot down a word or two, and we can have that as part of our discussion when this ends, and I'm almost done. It's doubtful that Clarinda ever returned to Roswell. These letters seem to be the final fragments of Clarinda's life that have survived. But these few fragments, including the ones in Archibald's record book, are enough to fill in a picture of Clarinda and her family members' lives. Although not one photograph seems to ever have been taken of Clarinda or any of the other enslaved people who lived and worked on Smith's plantation. When you visit the Smith Plantation today, all of the enslaved people who lived there for decades are invisible. But it's not logical to think that they were not essential to the life of that plantation. Without the enslaved residents, the Smith Plantation could not have functioned as a farm business, and it could not have produced the great wealth that sustained the Smith family for many generations, well into the 21st century. For this presentation, I focused on Clarinda's family, but there were about 7 enslaved families and a number of single enslaved individuals without family members who were living on the Smith Plantation. In the future, I hope that more research will be done so that all their lives will be developed into more distinctive portraits. When that is done, proper respect can be given to all of the people who made the Smith Plantation prosper and all who called it home. Dina is going to look at questions and we'll go over questions, but I want you to take a look at the Smith house as it looks today, which is behind Dina. She has a picture of the house as it looks today. So if you come to visit, you're not going to see that old plantation house. You're going to see the new one that was refurbished and renovated in the 1940s. Thank you all for listening.
Thank you, Vita. Thank you so much for that presentation. Let me see if I am able to unmute everyone. I will go through the chats to see if we have any questions. But once we do that, please feel free to unmute yourself and we will open it up to questions and conversation. Some interesting things going back and forth. In the chat if you're able to read it. It looks like I think we all agree the question in the letter of asking the age it does break your heart when you think of the reasoning behind that. So it's interesting. I encourage you all just scroll down through the comments to see everyone's reactions. Someone is asking, I'm curious about how Lucinda, Corinda adopted the Richardson surname. Vita and I were actually talking about that previously, but Vita, I'll let you give your answer to that.
Okay, Clarinda's daughter's father's name was Aaron Richardson. At this point in time, we have very little information about where he came from and what happened to him. Corinda doesn't talk about him at all in the 1886 letter. She had one child, and that was Maria, and she kept his surname Richardson, but he's never mentioned in Archibald's books.
So he's under the bus now too.
Pardon?
But that's okay. Go ahead, Vita.
Okay, so we don't know if he was from a nearby plantation or farm. That's just a question we can't answer, but he was listed as her mate on a genealogy chart and the father of Maria.
All right. We have another question that's really interesting. Anything available on their Gullah origin, when, where, from, whom they were bought? So I'm thinking, asking about the origin of Corinda and her family, if we have any.
Well, Clarinda's mother, Nanny, was born in the Savannah area, and her father, Morris. All of the enslaved people who came with Archibald came from the Savannah area. The families that he inherited belonged originally to his father. And yes, that is the Gullah area in Savannah, along the St. Mary's River and along the coast. We do know that there are a lot of baskets, woven baskets, that are still in the collection of the Smiths. They were found in the attic. Those are Gullah baskets. Those are the kinds of baskets that the Gullah people wove in the Savannah area. So those baskets were probably brought from Savannah with the enslaved people, and some of them might have been basket makers. That was not recorded. We can't say who made the baskets, but they were definitely baskets from the Savannah region.
Okay. Let's see here. I'm scrolling down through the messages. A lot of comments about a reaction toward the tone of the letter. Vita, would you be able to speak to that and your own impression on that about the tone of Corinda's letter?
Well, the tone is very intimate. And I say that and I have to acknowledge that she felt close to Miss Lizzie. She felt close to Master Archie. She felt close to Miss Helen. Um, she doesn't write the letter to Mrs. Smith for some reason. That's a question in my mind. But and she says that Moses was her sister's eldest child. Moses and his family send their love. When we look at historical documents, we would like for them to say what we want them to say, but they don't always do that. So we have to acknowledge that there were relationships developed among enslaved people and the people that they worked for. And if you worked in the house with someone for over 20 years, what do you think? I don't want to answer that. Now, I see one of my professor friends on the line has asked me a question about trauma. And that is a word that has become very current in terms of thinking about enslaved people. Of course, Clarinda suffered trauma, the trauma of losing her brother Frederick when he died, the trauma of her oldest brother being sold. Uh, I will let the people who are doing the research on trauma answer that, but that is an important question to think about. But Clarinda does not mention anything about that in the letter. I don't know what causes her to ask about her age. Maybe she would have been eligible for some kind of pension, for some kind of Social Security, but I don't think so because farm workers were excluded from Social Security when it was first passed. So, why her age was important to her at that time, I'm not sure. But it certainly would be trauma if um, you didn't know how old you were. You couldn't say exactly how old you were, or nor your daughter. You couldn't say their ages. We know that that was a problem when Frederick Douglass wrote his autobiography. He didn't know his age, but researchers went back to that plantation and they were able to sort of pinpoint the date of Frederick Douglass's birth. But that is a simple question that I guess it would haunt you for the rest of your life if you didn't know exactly what your age would be. I know I didn't answer that the way you wanted me to, but I tried.
That's okay. Um, Vita, were there any other letters that you're aware of in your research, um, or let me ask, what has surprised you about your research regarding this particular story and Corinda's life?
The fact that the Sister Sue is obscured, that the deaths of Morris and Nanny are not mentioned at all. These were some of the first people that Archibald inherited, and he relied on them extensively, and they were very loyal to the family. So I wanted to find more information out about them, but so far I haven't. Now there is more documentation to study in the Georgia State Archives. So hopefully we will be able to find out more about these people, but they lived for into their 60s, but there's very, very little mention of them anywhere.
Um, And again, bear with me, everyone. I'm just trying to scroll through everyone's responses, see if I can find specific questions here.
Well,
Um,
I see one, Dina.
sure.
Someone is asking about the Federal Writers Project that was undertaken in the 1930s during the Great Depression.
Right.
A number of African American writers were given the job of interviewing former slaves before the last generation of slaves died. And there are lots of books that have been published giving those interviews and the informants' statements. I'm sure there is a Georgia document for the Federal Writers Project. I have not checked that. That would be a source to check to see if any of the Smiths enslaved people were interviewed. They would have been interviewed in Valdosta. They would not have been interviewed in Roswell because they didn't come back to Roswell. They stayed in Valdosta. But that is a source that can be checked.
Excellent. Excellent. Someone has a question, has the Smith Plantation considered a form of reparations to the formerly enslaved? That's a difficult question to answer. And honestly, I do not know. The Smith Plantation as property was purchased by the city of Roswell in the 80s. And so it's difficult for me to answer that question. I will say, from our perspective as staff, and one of the reasons why we're having a program like this is that we truly wish moving forward to focus on a renewed focus on research and really valuing and doing the hard work of making sure that we are telling a more inclusive story and we're bringing light to these individuals and their humanity and what it speaks to a larger scale in terms of the interpretation and Roswell interpretation. So we are working on that, and that is the very least we can do. But in terms of anything else regarding that type of question, that's very hard for me to answer at this time. Um, were there any attempted escapes that I'm assuming from the Smith plantation from the family? Did you ever come across anything regarding that, Vita?
I haven't seen anything yet, but there are lots of documents that I haven't looked at. However, if Clarissa is on the line now, Clarissa is a historic. Um, she does historical cooking, and she cooks every other Saturday in that cookhouse
Mm-hmm.
in the backyard of the Smith Plantation. In fact, she's cooking today, isn't she,
Yes,
Dina?
she is. Yes.
She has some information about Hannah, who was the cook. And she has told me that Hannah did run away. I have not done that research. I cannot um, um, validate that at this time, but that is the next line of research that I want to do.
Yes. And bringing all that together so that we can tell that story. Um, Clarissa was much younger than her sister and brothers, correct? Any insight on that? And I guess just wondering more about the time.
Well, this was interesting to me as well because, and um, obviously Nanny, when she first came to Cobb County, she had almost all three of her first children were almost adults, 20, 22, and 16. And we don't know who their father was. Morris also came in 1838, and he was with another woman. I think that the first enslaved wife died, and Morris and Nanny became a couple. And that's how Clarinda and why Clarinda is only 4. She was born in St. Mary's, but she was 4 years old when she came to Cobb County. So perhaps Morris's first wife did not come to Cobb County because she died beforehand. That's the only explanation I can give at this point because Morris was her father.
We have a question here. Do you have any oral stories from the current family? Vita, I'll let you speak to that first.
The current family, meaning who?
I'm assuming the Skinners. Just for everyone's knowledge, the last descendants with Arthur and Mary Smith that lived in the house, once they passed away, and Vita, correct me if I'm wrong here, I think they passed away in the 60s. Is that correct?
Mary passed away in the 80s. She passed away in 1981.
It went to Mary married into the family, the Smith family, after Arthur and Mary both passed away. The house was left to Mary's nephew, and that was the Skinner family. And it's the Skinner family that sold the property to the city of Roswell. But Vita, I'll let you speak more to that as well.
Well, I have met one of the Skinners. They do have some stories, but I don't think that they have been interviewed specifically about stories. That's also, but you know, we're talking about, this would be the grandson of the Skinners who actually inherited the house. The ones who actually inherited the house, I don't know if they're all still alive. They did write a book. They wrote it. Well, one of the things that we found out, well, I didn't find it out, but the people who went through the house after Mary died, was a trunk full of letters. And all of these letters were letters that were written to Willie, the oldest son, when he was serving in Savannah in a Civil War Confederate unit. His mother, his father, his sisters wrote letters to him weekly, and he saved all these letters, and they were found in the attic of the house in 1964 when, or maybe 1984, when Mary died. And so the Skinners at that time, who are very elderly now if they're still alive, organized all the letters and wrote a book about the life of Willie and the family during the Civil War. So the information about Mrs. Smith packing up to go to Valdosta, it comes from that book. And she mentions Clarissa, and Clarissa's sick and she can't work, and I'm not sure what to pack up. So that is a document, but it's based on the letters. And Willie died during the Civil War. He did not die in battle. He died as a result of, was it dysentery, or a lot of Civil War soldiers died of illness because conditions were not hygienic during the Civil War. So he died, and all of his belongings were packed in a trunk and sent home to his family. And those letters were found. Well, I'm sure the Smiths who lost their son did not want to go through the letters, so they put him in the attic. But when the house passed into the second generation and the third generation, they looked at the letters and wrote a book about the Civil War years of Willie and the family. So we have those documents.
Yeah. Okay, we have another question. It says, how early was there a free black church? So I think regarding some of the church history in Roswell.
Well, we don't have a lot of church history in Roswell. What we do know is that Nanny and Morris were accepted into Lebanon Baptist Church in Cobb County. From my understanding, Lebanon Baptist Church was not an African American church. It was a majority white Baptist church, but they did allow enslaved people to sit in certain areas in that church. There is a document on African American history in the city of Roswell that lists the name of the first African American church. Please forgive me, I cannot remember the name of it. But there was another church that was started, but it wasn't Lebanon. Lebanon and most of the enslaved people on the Smith Plantation were baptized in Lebanon Baptist Church. So they attended this church. And I would like to find out where the records of baptisms are for that church. It was very close to the property where the enslaved people lived. But I don't know if any records have survived. That is another avenue of research that needs to be done. And if you send me that question again, I know where the document is that says the name of the first African American church in Cobb County, but I would have to find it, and I don't want to take up that time. But there, I do know the name. We do know the name of that church.
Well, there is always work to do in research. I would tell you that. I think one last question. We're coming to a close here. I think just for the edification of everyone, just out of curiosity, what do you recommend, Vita, in terms of research and someone that might be interested in exploring, the enslaved experience, the slave story, particularly when it comes to a Pacific side? So, what's your best recommendation when it comes to learning and research?
Well, the best way to learn is to learn how to do genealogy.
Mhm.
And I was listening to a program on NPR a couple of days ago called the Inheritance Project. And they are trying to help people learn how to do genealogy. But usually, if you're studying enslaved people, they were not listed by first and last name until 1870, until the 1870 census. Well, in 1870, there were no enslaved people. Slavery was over. So getting back beyond 1870, before 1870, there is a wall that genealogists have to figure out how to cross. The best way to get beyond that wall is to know what county your ancestors were from and look at all of the plantations in that county and see if someone by your ancestor's name, only the first name, at that age would be listed. That's how genealogists have to follow enslaved people. It is a very difficult task, but some genealogists are very good at it.
That's true.
Not
And
me.
as we've discussed, Vita, it just leads to more and more questions.
Mhm.
So it's a fascinating topic. Okay, so someone is asking, will we be able to view this presentation again? Yes, give me, if you don't mind, till the end of the week, and we will make sure that is on our website, southerntrilogy.com, so that you may see it again. And also, could I please get the title of the book of letters? Oh, Vita, please help me remember that. There we go. Death of a Confederate. And it's by the Skinner family. What's the name of the author, Vita?
Arthur Skinner and James Skinner. Those are the grandsons of the original Skinners. It's called Death of a Confederate, The Death of a Confederate.
Thank you so much.
Okay.
You're welcome. So, in order to wrap up, does everyone feel free to unmute yourself if anyone would like to offer a last question? Okay. If not, again, everyone, thank you so much. And thank you, Dr. Tucker. Thank you, Vita,
Okay.
and everyone for your participation this afternoon. We do hope this discussion provides a more holistic picture and understanding of the Smith Plantation history that was informative or perhaps gave you something to consider. I invite you to visit roswellroots.com for the full list of activities and programs occurring this month. And just so you know, and if you're local and this has already come up, we do offer open hearth cooking demonstrations at Smith Plantation. There's one occurring today with Clarissa Lynch. She is a longtime cooking interpreter, historian. The next cooking demonstration will be on February 27th, which takes place in the cookhouse at Smith Plantation. Demonstrations are for free to the public and are typically between 10 a.m. and 3 p.m. or just as long as activities for the cooking last. I would also like to mention that Roswell's historic assets are part of the Recreation, Parks, Historic, and Cultural Affairs Department. We offer a broad range of programs and activities for people of all ages throughout the year, and our Spring 2021 brochure is currently available. Please do not hesitate to look us up online at roswellgov.com. But again, Vita, thank you so much. Thank you everyone for participating. I hope you found it to be very interesting. And have a wonderful afternoon. Goodbye, everyone. Thank you. Okay.